Think about the expression living thing. Think about it as a linguist. Don't think about it as a scientist for now. That sentence has a subject and a predicate. The subject is the thing, and the predicate is living. But as a logician, think about what a predicate is. A construction of that form says the primary objects of our discourse are things. Anything we care about must start with things. Now, I want to take the universe of all things, and I want to group it into two sets, the living ones and the not living ones. And the predicate tells me which set I'm in. So I will say, in having chosen to frame the sentence that way, people have committed what logicians call a category error. Because the starting point in the universe is not things. And so if you start your sentence by committing to beginning with things, you have already boxed yourself into a blind end that you can't escape from, and there is no answer to that question.
Erica Smith received a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Mathematics from the California Institute of Technology in 1987 and a PhD in Physics from the University of Texas at Austin in 1993 with a dissertation on problems in string theory and high-temperature superconductivity from 1993 to 2000. He worked in physical, nonlinear, and statistical acoustics at the Applied Research Labs, UT Austin, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. From 2000, he has worked at the Santa Fe Institute on problems of self-organization in thermal, chemical, and biological systems. A focus on his current work is the statistical mechanics of the transition from the geochemistry of the early Earth to the first levels of biological organization, with some emphasis on the emergence of metabolic network. He is also the co-author of The Origin and Nature of Life on Earth, The Emergence of the Fourth Geosphere. So you seem to have a very interesting resume. So how... You first studied physics, then you moved into studying the origins of life. So how did you decide to make that transition?
Yeah, I would not have had the sense to make that decision. Other people made it for me. So when you don't get a job, you try to find a way to survive. And when it was clear I was not going to continue in high energy physics, I had a period of scrambling, of just trying to find any kind of work I could do. And so I started a line of research myself in the house and just started publishing from the house and tried to find a profession where I could keep some contact with science and still go to meetings and still learn things, even if it was not connected to what I was interested in research-wise. And the place where I could find that was in acoustics research for the Navy and some oceanography work and material science and things like that. So I just did a kind of a hodgepodge of jobs, whatever I could find. And of course, science is science. The same math shows up over and over again in all kinds of areas. And so if you're looking for interesting problems, you'll find them wherever you're working. And for me, the interesting problems turned out to be in areas of self-organizing processes that make engines. And this is why there are no wise young people in biochemistry, because you have to memorize things for 70 years before you realize that the way it's organized is all quite simple. And young people who have not been doing that for 70 years don't have that experience. And I thought, okay, I'm never going to get anywhere on this because it's a million facts and a million details and there's no big picture. And there's more in that story, but it's not interesting to tell. When I went to the Santa Fe Institute, this is the importance of knowing people, because you don't know what to look for. But if you have a community and if they know you and they know others, they will know who you should meet even if you don't know it. And some people there said, you need to meet Harold Morowitz, because when you two talk, you say completely different things, but you sound exactly the same. And so I met Harold, and Harold said, here's all this set of things in biochemistry that I'm sure are universal. I'm sure they have a law-like explanation, but I don't have a mathematical way of approaching that question. And I said, I have this mathematics that I'm sure explains something, but I don't know what to look for because all I get is human physiology and medicine. And of course, if you want to look at biochemistry, starting with human physiology and medicine is like having this beautiful new telescope and saying, well, here's the big end. I'll look in through the big end. And you say, oh, I don't understand. Everything looks so far away. Well, with a telescope, you're supposed to start looking through the small end. And if you look through the big end, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Microbiology is the same way. If you want to understand biochemistry, you start with microbiology and the deep evolution of bacteria, and then you can see the sense of the field unfolding. And it's only late, and complicated when you get to human physiology and medicine. So that the awareness of that and all of the things that Harold had learned from 50 years, he was an old man by the time I met him, so he had time to become wise. All of the accumulation of that knowledge that Harold had gathered allowed us to pick out the things in biochemistry that should have law-like explanations. And then for me, coming with mathematics and physics ideas, I had things that I could start with that were not infinitely complicated. They were fairly simple, a few molecules, a few pathways, and that was enough to get us started working. And that was the beginning of a 25-year collaboration, I guess, or close to it, that led to the book that you guys found.
Oh, wow.
So it's very, very circuitous.
So yeah, just for our audience, Harold is your co-author.
Correct.
So you worked 25 years to write the book?
Or close to it. Maybe not
Wow.
25, maybe 17, something like that. But long time, yeah.
Wow.
So that's another thing I believe in. I think that if you want to do interdisciplinary work, you need to pick good collaborators. You need to think of yourself as becoming their student, and they will think of themselves as becoming your student. And then you need to stay with them for a long time, because it takes a long time to learn to think in new ways. So you have to have patience, and you have to trust each other.
And what were some of the breakthroughs that came out of your collaboration?
I'm not sure we ever had any breakthroughs, but we were able to say some things that were kind of sensible, which is good enough for me.
Yeah.
The idea that Harold had an idea for a long time, since long before he met me, and I don't think he came up with it. I think Günther Wächtershäuser in Germany was one of the first people to see it, and maybe even earlier than him. But the citric acid cycle is certainly the organizing center of all biochemistry in all living things on Earth. If you try to do phylogenetic reconstructions, sort of the deep history of ancient bacteria, it's not easy to construct the citric acid cycle as a carbon fixation cycle all the way back to the beginning. There are other pathways that look like they're easier to take all the way back to the beginning. But those other pathways are not the organizing center of all of biochemistry, and the citric acid cycle is. And so if you're a physicist and you see that even when there's all this complexity and historical revision that living systems do, but they always attach back to the same point, your impulse is to think that that point has informational importance. It's a kind of an anchoring point that other things attach themselves back to, and that requires an explanation. If you work mostly in a historical field like phylogenetics, you don't feel like you have to ask for a causal explanation, because you can just say, well, it got fixed historically, and then once it was locked in, other things attract to it, but you're not necessarily looking for cause. If you're a physicist and you find an object, you feel like you have an obligation to explain why that object came into existence. And history may tell you part of the reason it played roles afterward, but history may not be a complete account for why it existed in the first place. And there were many people in Santa Fe, my colleague Walter Fontana, who brought me to Santa Fe, who very strongly influenced my thinking in these ways. Walter has a beautiful series of papers from long ago with Leo Buss, with titles like The Arrival of the Fittest. And he's saying, Darwin can explain to you why some things survive over other things once they exist. But that doesn't address the separate question of how you come into existence when nothing of that kind had ever existed before. And that's a problem that lives in another domain within science that also has to be solved. So how do we go after that problem?
Maybe there is a law of coming to existence.
Or many, yes.
Oh, okay. So we know for a fact that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and apparently life has been around, or is consistent with our models of being around for around 4 billion years. And the first 500 million years, it wasn't really possible chemically for life to form. So as soon as it was possible for life to form, it formed.
It's a reasonable guess, yes.
Oh, is it? Are there other models?
There's a ton of uncertainty.
Right.
People are pretty confident that you have fully formed cellular life at 3.5 billion. There are people who are willing to speculate you could go back to 4.1, maybe. But that's 600 million years in which it's really hard to say that things are confident or can be even precisely described. 3.8, still most people are reasonably confident. They would be surprised if there were no life that early. But that's the strongest statement a reasonable person will make, is I would be surprised. But it's not something like engineering trains where you really know what you're talking about with certainty. It's a lot looser than that.
Right. Yeah. But it's still, it was okay. That would change things. So, are you on the side of it being laws of nature that force it to come, that want life to come into existence, or do you think it could have been a jackpot?
Right. You can't rule out the jackpot, but I think in a science of historical phenomena, ruling out the jackpot is not the correct goal. Instead, you say that there are many common signatures of things in nature that work in kind of the same way. So it's not only how something comes into existence, but how it behaves after it exists. Is it roughly stable? Does it tend to stand up if you poke at it, or does it fall apart? And the things that are unlikely to happen often are also fragile. That's not true all the time. But you look for the signatures around something that suggest whether its origin is more lawful or more accident-driven. And you try to make a preponderance of evidence argument. It's so hard. I apologize that my sentences are so long, but it's so hard to speak carefully and say what you mean. If you ask me whether 5 fingers on the vertebrate hand are probably lawful, I'm going to guess no. And I also know that it's not true because we have fish that have lots of vertebral variability, and we know how digits form, and we know that it's a reaction diffusion pattern that lays down bone. And so we have lots of ways of knowing that fingers on the hand are accidental. If you ask me about the amino acids, now we're starting to get into more complicated territory. For some of the simpler ones, like 12 or 13 of the simpler ones, they are completely anchored around the citric acid cycle. So while I don't know how accidental or how certain either one of them is, I don't think we have two questions of accident. I think we have one question, and however certain one of them is, the other one is almost exactly as certain. But then you get to the other 6 or 7 or 8, depending on how you want to divide amino acids that are more complicated. Maybe there are some aspects of them that look more like the digits on the vertebrate hand, in the sense that they have elements of things that couldn't really have been much different and elements of things that could have been. But when you're faced with a situation like that, you get up to a point where you know you can't make stronger statements with the things you know. So then you go back to analyzing the way you argue, and you say, what is the weakest point in my argument? What is the area where I get most stuck? And where do I need to start looking for new evidence to find a better way of arguing in the place where my arguments are weakest? And so for me, that has meant you do the best you can. You try to write a long book so that the arguments don't get lost. And then you go back to the beginning and start over, and you try to educate yourself in a new area. And for us, the new area was combinatorics of chemistry, because the chemical possibility space is so large that if I look at metabolism, I can tell you all the ways metabolism is special. You know, simple chemicals, functional groups that are relatively easy to form with simple chemistry, and when they're formed, they create environments where similar reactions can act again, so you don't need a lot of innovation to use that chemistry to build things up. Now, there are important gaps, questions nobody has a way to answer, but I can tell you about how those things are special. Someone who doesn't think that means they're unique can say, well, chemistry is so big, we're sure that similarly special things would be found in many other areas. And I say, how sure are you? How big is chemistry? And they say, chemistry is very, very big. And I realize that we're not talking science anymore, we're watching Monty Python, right? So clearly what both of us have to do is build tools to find out just how big chemistry is. And it's right that chemistry is very, very big. And most questions you ask about it, you don't really even have ways to systematically navigate the space. They know, and then they pick a point somewhere in the space and try to solve a problem. And they do however well they can do. And then somebody else who knows something else different will pick a point somewhere else in the space and try to solve a problem. It's great, it's much better than nothing, and it's how we gain knowledge. But if all you're doing is picking points here and there in the space, you're limited by human intuition and experience. And if different people have experience from different domains that doesn't really have a good overlap, then you get these kind of unsatisfying conversations that Origin of Life has had for so many decades, where person A believes hypothesis 1, person B believes hypothesis 2, and they have no way to address each other because they emphasize completely different things, and there's no way for either one to productively engage with the reasons the other person believes something different. And so at that point, that's when you go back and you analyze the argument and you say, we need better ways to navigate chemical space so that we can find out how big it is, what is the null hypothesis, how hard is the search for us doing science, how hard was the search for nature, having random processes waiting to stumble upon something that maybe has order. And so we then go back to building tools, and that's kind of where a lot of us are these days. I told you we had a student doing a presentation earlier this morning. What she's working on is trying to estimate how big the chemical space is and how many kinds of molecules might have the kinds of special properties that biomolecules have. And this is an area where 20 years ago, the computational tools were not good enough to be of a lot of help. So chemists largely were sort of scornful of them. They thought, well, these are not helping us do what we know how to do well. But the chemical tools have become a lot better, and the chemists have gotten up to the edge of what they can do well with their own intuitive methods. So that handshake, that collaboration is starting to become more productive now, rapidly. And so I think there's good work we can do in those areas.
It would be interesting to find out how big of a domain we're talking about, because it seems like, based on what you're saying, that we don't even know the magnitude of the problem of.
That's right.
Right. Um. So I also heard you said people say chemistry is big, but you're skeptical of the idea.
No. They're entirely right.
Right. Okay.
The problem is that unless you can start to attach numbers to how big things are, and unless you start to have the ability to navigate, you're not in the domain of modern systematic science anymore. You're back in the domain of natural philosophy and just exploring and hoping you stumble on something. But you realize that you can't build bridges by hoping you stumble on things. You start your science always with natural philosophy and discovery, but you have to move out of that phase into a phase where you say, if I'm stuck and if we disagree, we have to find a way to backtrack to the last thing we agreed on and figure out what's missing and how to find it with better than random chance. And those are the methods that we now have to build up.
Right, it's more of a logical problem as opposed to the statement. You have to define big before starting to do any research further, right? And I heard you talk about citric acid cycles. Could you tell us what they are? What we mean
Sure.
by citric acid cycles with regards
Sure.
to living things?
You bet. So, like everything else, this was discovered backward. And it's not surprising, right? We live in the human world. We see things that are big enough for us to see. So we begin our discovery of everything from the human perspective. But of course, from the standpoint of life on Earth, the ecosystems where they become possible are highly interdependent and highly complex. So anything that you see in the human world is going to be overwhelmingly colored by all the accidents of history that made that possible. So the citric acid cycle was discovered in humans. It is a cycle with 11 small molecules. They have between 2 carbons and 6 carbons, depending on how you count. Some people will count more, 12 or 13, if they look at the activated versions of some of the molecules. I'm counting 11 because I'm counting the carbon backbones. You have 11 reactions that convert the carbon backbones. It was discovered by Hans Krebs, I think in 1935 or 37. I forget the year. And it was discovered to be the pathway that we use to break down either sugars or fats. In the process of respiration, we break them down into carbon dioxide that we exhale, and then we use the energy from that breakdown to drive all the rest of our metabolism. So without the citric acid cycle, we have no metabolism, we have no respiration, we have no life. It turns out it was not Krebs's first interest at the time, because you have to realize how limited the tools of biochemistry are when he was working. It was an astonishing accomplishment to figure out what this cycle was and how it worked with the tools available at the time. But as we look from a modern perspective at the citric acid cycle, you also realize that every chemical that is built, not only by us, but by any organism, has a starting compound in the citric acid cycle. So you look at the whole biosphere, all these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different compounds that are built, organic compounds, all of them start from one of 4 or 5 precursors in the same cycle, which is astonishing, right? So it's more astonishing than the fact that every composition in literature is made out of the same letters. Because if your literature is English, you have 26 letters and you have maybe 40 or 100,000 words. That's a lot. But it would be as if much more than everything in literature were made from only 4 letters or 5 letters, and all of the words were built up from only that. That's how biochemistry is organized. But if you look at the citric acid cycle as it was discovered in view of that biochemical organization, it seems strange and it's hard to make sense of. because as a respiratory process, it takes in complicated molecules that are already complicated, sugars or fats. It breaks them down to carbon dioxide, which is not organic and it's not complicated. But then it uses the intermediates in the breakdown to build up everything else. Vitamins and amino acids and nucleotides and all that stuff. So what will it be? Is it breaking down or is it building up? Well, in us, it's doing both, and that's hard to understand. So the discovery that was made much later in 1966 by Robert Arnon and then, Buchanan, I forget the names. It's the Buchanan-Arnon paper. You would think I would know these things, but I've been doing math since January, and my mind is in math world, and I'm forgetting my history and my facts.
We love our maths here, don't worry.
Yes. They were trying to understand how a species of bacterium was fixing carbon, how it was taking in carbon dioxide and using it to make more complicated organic molecules. And it's a photosynthetic organism, but it was not using the Calvin cycle, which was how everyone believed photosynthesis worked. And Buchanan and Arnon, and a third guy whose name, I feel bad because he was important too and I should remember his name. I'll think of it. Evans. What Evans, Buchanan, and Arnon were eventually able to work out is that this bacterium, I think it was Chloroflexus auranticus, was using the same molecules as the citric acid cycle and more or less the same reactions, and it was running them in the opposite direction that we run it in. So we take in sugar or fat, we respire carbon dioxide, and we use oxygen to break down those organics to CO2, which is where the oxygen and CO2 is coming from, to get energy. They were taking energy from someplace else, from photosynthesis. They were taking in CO2 instead of breathing it out, and they were building up all of the molecules, such as sugars and fats, by running the reactions in the opposite direction. But as soon as you look at that, you say, oh, this one makes sense. In humans, it didn't make sense, but in these bacteria, it makes sense because it's all building. They start from CO2, they make 2 carbon compounds and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 carbon compounds, and they grow the carbon. It's like flypaper. The carbon is sticky and the CO2 attaches to it. And out of that, they make sugars and fats, and they also make everything else. They make all the vitamins, they make all the amino acids, they make all the nucleic acids, and anything else more complicated made from those. And so you say, aha, this is the thing that made sense. And Krebs himself, I think in 1981, was looking at the Buchanan-Arnon. It's called the reductive citric acid cycle because it's consuming electrons. We can come back to why it's called that if you want. Krebs looked at it and said, this is the version that was on Earth before the version I discovered. My version happened after the original version, which was a building up version, got reversed and turned into a breaking down version to be a core of energy metabolism. But that happened after there was oxygen on Earth and after there was a way of reusing these compounds. And now it is, I would say, universally believed that that's the correct understanding. I'm sure you can find, in fact, I even know one. You can find a scientist here or there who wants to put Krebs's version of the cycle very, very early on Earth. But in terms of what really reconstructs as the history of bacteria, the deep history is that its role as a carbon fixation was early. And then much later, when it became useful to live in complicated ecosystems and break carbon molecules down, and when you had sources of oxidants, then it became productive to start doing more complicated stuff with the cycle, running different parts of the pathway independently, reversing the pathway, that kind of thing. So at least now, the core structure of metabolism makes sense when viewed from a microbiology and a historical point of view. And so what Harold and I did together, working for many years, was to just try to get the common sense version of this picture worked out and to to hook it into the rest of metabolism. And I should mention a wonderful junior colleague I had in the last several years of that work, Rogier Brackmann, who's currently at MIT. Rogier worked with me to understand. When I had worked with Harold, we had mostly been concerned with the citric acid cycle and a few molecules around it, the simple amino acids. Rogier worked with me, and the primary work was really his. All of the deep insights were his discoveries and the invention, and most of the work was done by him to fill out how this became the core of all the rest of the innovations in carbon fixation and sort of the rest of core biochemistry. So that was what we did for that period before I had to go back and sort of start to learn about chemistry as a null model with a new set of collaborators and a new set of projects.
How do you define a living thing? Because I know I've had many different definitions. In fact, I interviewed Andrew Knoll 2 episodes ago, and he told me, "Oh, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it." So, could you tell us what your definition, how you define, how do you approach the problem?
Your choice of words is just wonderful, because you started asking how I define a living thing, and I was going to answer, I don't ever. But you already recognized, in some sense, you have an intuition for where the core of the problem is, because then you changed your question. You asked, how do you approach the problem? And the first question of defining the living thing is not a proper question. The second question of approaching the problem is exactly the right question. So now I'll give you a harangue you didn't ask for, but it's one of my favorites.
Great.
Think about the expression living thing. Think about it as a linguist. Don't think about it as a scientist for now. That sentence has a subject and a predicate. The subject is the thing, and the predicate is living. But as a logician, think about what a predicate is. A construction of that form says the primary objects of our discourse are things. Anything we care about must start with things. Now, I want to take the universe of all things, and I want to group it into 2 sets, the living ones and the not living ones. And the predicate tells me which set I'm in. So I will say, in having chosen to frame the sentence that way, people have committed what logicians call a category error. Because the starting point in the universe is not things. And so if you start your sentence by committing to beginning with things, you have already boxed yourself into a blind end that you can't escape from, and there is no answer to that question. Because it treats living as a predicate of things, as if things carried the property of life or not life within them. And I know why we make this category error, but it's a metaphor error. So you're interdisciplinary, so I know I can lead you off on these tangents and you won't get bored instantly. Scientists tend to get bored instantly, but younger people are better. So we started in a sort of pre-Aristotelian time. We know about living and dead, right? These are the fish in the sea that are living. These are the fish on the shore that are dead. And if you're starting with fish, it's perfectly fine to partition them into the live ones and the dead ones. But that's living and dead in regard to the life cycle. Let's come into the Aristotelian categorization. And now we're not talking about living and dead within a life cycle. We're talking about being part of the biosphere or being part of something that somehow is not the same as the biosphere. That's not the same. Metaphorically, it kind of resembles the living and dead, but you know that a rock is not the same kind of a thing as a dead fish. Because a rock was never alive in the sense that the fish was once alive. But if we take our living dead predicate for fish and we try to apply it to biosphere, non-biosphere, we're doing that by metaphor. We're not doing it by science, and we're not doing it by a careful understanding of what we mean. So I want to say that is the source of all the wrong turns that happened since, is using that metaphor where it should not be used, and starting with life as a predicate when life is not a predicate. That's not a survivable way to try to use the term. So now let me replace, having told you I think that's an error, we never understand errors until we see something that we say is not an error, and we can look back and say, oh, that's why the other thing was an error, right? Like we didn't know there was a problem with Newtonian gravity until we had Einstein gravity to replace it. We didn't know that classical mechanics was a problem until we had quantum mechanics to replace it. So if I want to say that treating life as a predicate is a problem, I have to tell you what I'm going to replace it by that is not a problem and that allows us to look back on it. And I will say that the right answer is coming from the concept of phase transitions as we have spent the last 100 years discovering it in modern physics. So if I give you one water molecule and I say, oh, is that a liquid water molecule or is that a vapor water molecule? Of course, that can't be answered because the water molecule is a thing, but the property of being a liquid or a vapor is not carried by that molecule. It's not a predicate that you can use to sort the water molecules into the ones that are liquid and the ones that are vapor. Because being a liquid or a vapor is a property of relations, not only of a finite number of water molecules to each other, but of an indefinitely large collection of water molecules that work together to maintain the structure of relations. So liquid is a phase, vapor is a phase, and I had someone remind me just earlier this week that when the Greeks were looking for an atomic theory of nature, they didn't get the atoms right, but they realized the phases and they got those right. So think of what earth, water, air, and fire are. They are the solid, the liquid, the vapor, and the plasma phases.
Wow.
Pretty impressive, but also a lesson for all of us that it took us thousands of years to go through all of our physics of objects, go through phase transitions, the discovery of thermodynamics, the discovery of quantum field theory, the renormalization group, and the modern theory of matter. And at the end of all of that, we now have a theory where we realize it's actually all distributions and phases. Everything we thought was an object, we now explain in terms of distributions in the modern quantum field theory of matter and phase transitions and renormalization group. Sorry for all this technical jargon, but
I love it. I love it.
I will reward you at the end. We find out that the most reliable things in our ontology are the same kinds of things that were most recognizable to the Greeks so long ago, though we know about many more of them now. They are the phases, they are the stable structures of relations. So now let me come back to the question about life on planets. We think we can reliably imagine planets without life. Certainly if you get hot enough and molten enough, you don't have organized organic chemistry, we're sure we're safe there. So deep in the Hadean Earth must have been that way for a while. We can look at Venus, we can look at Mars, they probably are planets without life now. Venus, really good bet. Mercury, even better bet. Mars, less certain, but still probable, I would say. And then we can look at the Earth, and clearly the Earth has a biosphere. So now I can say, what is the major difference between a planet without a biosphere and a planet with a biosphere? What is the robust thing that no matter what happens, never changes? So think of all the things on Earth that have changed. You know, maybe once there was only RNA, now there's RNA and DNA. Maybe once there were only bacterial and archaeal cells, now there are eukaryotic cells. Once there were only unicellular organisms, now there are multicellular organisms. Ecosystems grow, everything gets turned over, there's this constant Darwinian churning, and then there are innovations that get made. Once there was no oxygen on the surface, now there's major oxygen on the surface that changes everything. In all of that, in planets without life, your organic chemistry always lives over in one corner of the chemical space, where it's dominated by things that are relatively near equilibrium or whose complexity is of a limited form, and it tends to be dominated by things that are messy, meaning that if you have a molecule of a certain size or certain structure, you probably have lots of other molecules that are of similar size or structure to it. If I compare that to a planet with a biosphere has huge concentrations, gigatons of carbon, in only a very small number of molecular species. And the ways those molecular species are made are even smaller. They're all built up from these 4 tiny intermediates. So there's extreme complexity in that you have large molecules, structured molecules, and high concentrations, extreme concentrations of exact molecular species, and very low concentrations of things that are fairly close neighbors of them, and that you would think are similar. And if instead of just looking at the molecules, you look at the pathways by which they're made, the selectivity is even more extreme than it is for the substance. That property of a planet with a biosphere has never changed, even as everything else about cellular organization changes. And so if I look at that, I say as a physicist, that looks to me like a phase change. Because there was a structure of relations in planets without life, and there's a new structure of relations in planets with life. It's not maintained by any one molecule or any one cellular form or whatever. It's maintained by the whole thing together. And it's very robust, very self-maintaining. And interestingly enough, the identities and the roles of these molecules, they're not attached in a reliable way to species. Different species will be handling different parts of this traffic. But at the ecosystem level, they're very regular, they're very reliable. This is what the early papers that Harold and I were publishing on tried to emphasize, though many other people besides us also have seen it in the same forms. So then let's come back and let's ask, well, wait, we started talking about things. You have to at least say something about things. And I say, well, think of how much is going on in the biosphere. You have all these molecules and their roles. Little ones, you have macromolecules, peptides and RNAs and DNAs and all that stuff. You have cells and all the subcellular compartments. You have all the relations among members in ecosystems. All of those things are contributing to the robustness of the biosphere. In all of that, what is a cell? What is an individual? It's one architectural motif. So if I single out the organisms, the right question is to say, why are organisms such an important architectural motif for a living system? So now I'm not saying the property of life is a property of the thing. I'm saying the thing is a hugely important architecture in maintaining the living state at the level of the biosphere. And then we ask questions, why does individuality emerge? How many kinds of individuality are there? What is the nature of individuality? And then you realize there's tons of stuff we know in biology, right? So I have cells, and the cells have genomes, and the genomes stay at home. Viruses are genomes that don't stay at home. They come and live in somebody else's cell, and then when they make a mess, they leave. So there are at least 2 forms of individuality. There's the individuality of metabolism and bioenergetics in the cell, and then there's the individuality of a genomic life cycle, which may or may not be attached to a cell. And I can go on and on like this, and then you realize there's lots of stuff going on in the architectures of individuality. All of those are parts of the dynamic of the biosphere, but they are not carrying the property of living or not living. It's their participation in the biosphere that allows them to inherit this distinction between a planet with life and a planet without life. So I would replace the living thing predicate with the biosphere as the carrier of the living state. So far, so good?
Yep. This is the deepest conversation we've ever had on this podcast, just for the record. Very, very interesting, though. Right, so you've essentially shown me that the very framing of the question has built-in assumptions that are false, that we're not looking at it from the right, we're just saying, I think the idea might come from the idea of a spirit. Something has a spirit, something is either living or dead, but it's actually part of a greater system, and it participates. And right, wow.
You want me to give you a fun fact about that?
Yes, please.
Your intuitions are wonderful. And the thing that's best about being a scientist is that, of course, intuitions can always be wrong, but we know we should go looking for evidence. And then we can find out whether the intuition was in fact right or was spurious. So one of the areas where I had the complete joy of spending a lot of years working is the history of human languages and how they go back. And of course, if you look at languages across the Indo-European family, you immediately recognize that there are all these cognates of, common words. So the word to is the same everywhere in Indo-European. It's had hundreds of thousands of years of individual descent, but it hasn't changed. The word nephew is almost entirely preserved, whereas the words for butterflies and the tails of animals change all the time. But there's an interesting one where you could say, well, what is the Indo-European root for the word for animal? It seems like a decent question. It turns out it's not a well-formed question. And here's what we know about it. Let's take English, because I think I can remember the facts without getting lost in English. We have two words we have two words for everything in English, right? Because English is a Western Germanic language that then got all of Latin laid on it through Norman French, so it has two copies of the vocabulary. And if you want a completely wonderful discourse on this, read Jorge Luis Borges about Shakespeare and about how Shakespeare uses those two copies of the vocabulary to set up tension and release it, but I won't go on that tangent right now. But just think about our two copies of the vocabulary in English for the words for animal. One of them is animal, one of them is beast. If you trace those back, animal, of course, came from the Latin. And so it's the Latin word for these things. Beast comes from the Germanic, and it's the substratum word. Maybe it may have come in from some other funny direction like Irish, I forget. But eventually, the unraveling of the story is that if you work back, in ancient Indo-European, in Proto-Indo-European as spoken by people at the time, there was not a word for animal. There were two different words, one of which I believe is reconstructed as dus, which has to do with wildness and dangerousness. And through various things, that came down for the beasts, the wild animals. The other is ane, which was breath or spirit or soul. And the domesticated animals were ane. They were not the dangerous ones. They were the ones that wouldn't kill you and you could eat them. And then the dus were the wild ones that were dangerous. And so in modern language, we have chosen to make a separation between the two-legged animals and all the other animals. And so we think there's a word for animal separate from human. But if you reconstruct, you find that the categories apparently were different. And they were indeed the difference, exactly the difference you proposed, between things that you counted as having spirit or soul or being safe, and the things that were wild or dangerous in the surrounding hostile world. So I think there's good evidence for your intuition that this is how human minds tend to think of these things and parse them.
Yeah, I was listening very carefully because I'm Persian, so I was waiting to see if any of them register.
You'll find them, because of course Indo-Iranic is then one of the branches within Indo-European. Yeah. And I don't know enough Persian or Farsi vocabulary to immediately have good examples that spring to mind, but there are dozens of these things depending on
brother, mother. I think they're pretty much the same. Like moon, they're very between English and Persian at least.
Yeah, probably. Moon in Indic is chand. It comes from the word for shine or a dewdrop.
Oh.
So you have all these things like Chandrasekhar, Chandi, Chandru, family names and things like that. So that may have been a word shift, a lexical displacement.
And I've heard the word lux. Lux apparently, that has some Indo-European root as well.
It's an ancient root for salmon.
Right.
Yes.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, maybe we can dedicate another episode to the Indo-European language. Okay. So You know, when we talk about biosphere, isn't our problem, so when you say, you know, when you talked about the properties of biosphere, isn't our problem that we only have a sample size of one biosphere?
People like to say that. I don't favor that way of saying it so much.
Right.
Um, when I gave you that awful long-winded diatribe about living things, one of the reasons it's important to me to recognize it as a category error is that when we make the category error, there's all this stuff that we know in science that we understand well, that it doesn't occur to us to use. Whereas when we set the categories out in the right way, I think we're more attentive to the fact that all this other scientific knowledge is actually informative about how to pose the question. And I think the same way about this one sample, not one sample thing. Yes, in a sense, our biosphere is all connected. It's all connected by common descent as far as we can tell. That was such a big discovery when it came out that it kind of swept everything else off the board. And, you know, we still have all of this social conflict, people trying to say, you know, common descent is not a gigantic problem to accept. It's sort of overwhelmingly clear. And then there are people who don't like it and are constantly in tribal fights against it and so forth. That's the last war. That's a war that should have ended 100 years ago or 150 years ago, because it's not hard. But the problem is when you're so focused on the common descent part, you realize that some things may not happen. They may be common descent, but the reason they're there may not be that they're locked in and preserved. It may have been that they were so much easier to do that nothing else ever was really in play. So if I'm in an airplane and I fly over the desert, I don't see trees scattered here and there throughout the dry land with tap roots 400 meters deep to reach the water. Instead, I see that there are riverways and they're crowded with trees because the trees can get the water right up at the surface. And then everywhere else where there's not river, there are no trees. So if you're going to be a tree, you're going to be a tree where it's easy to be a tree. And in the same sense, if I look at the biosphere and biochemistry and I see everything concentrated in around a few molecules and a few reactions, my impulse is to think, okay, what we see are the trees. What we want to understand is what are the rivers that we're not recognizing to look for, the sort of paths of least resistance where it's easy to be a molecule. So the evolutionary view of life looks at molecules and asks, what are they good for doing? As a chemist or a physical chemist or a statistical physicist, if you look at the same molecules, you have the impulse to ask, what is the molecule good at being, as opposed to what is it good for doing? And of course, a molecule carries both of those sides. It's a coin that has both a front and a back. In order to exist, it's easier if it's something that it's good at being for carbon. In order to be important, it survives if it has evolutionary consequences, that it's good for doing something. If we ask what are the components of life good at being, then the answer to that for life on Earth may not be just one thing. It may be many things. And as we come to better understand the landscape of chemistry, and we learn to apply some of our tools of statistical physics for thinking in that complicated landscape, which is a much harder place to work than any place physics has ever worked before, we may find that there's tons of information in the biosphere, and it's not a sample size of one. It's a sample size of many, many, many. So I want us to be attentive to looking for all the other places in science where we know how to ask questions, but we have not been asking those questions of the biosphere before now, because we were framing the problem in a way that caused us to ignore them.
And for 100 years, in your opinion?
For the entire history of humanity.
Oh, wow.
The evolutionary insight, as a mathematical insight or a scientific insight, it should not have been remarkable, right? Because mathematically it's ordinary, scientifically it's ordinary. The thing that makes Darwin's science superb is that he had the big mind of what, an ecologist, a physiologist, a geologist all at the same time. He kept all that complexity in mind, and he was aware of the richness, able to distill that there were paths of causation that you could see amid all of the complexity that makes them hard to see. That's what you get from reading the original science. The idea that you can start with prior variation and you can filter it to get things that are better fitted to their environment, mathematically that could have been done 400 years earlier. The Bernoulli brothers could have understood that, because the Gambler's Ruin problem already has the seeds of all of that solution in it. And that was Bernoulli and Fermat and Pascal and all those guys. So that's not the interesting part of evolution. There are a few simple things that we should have just solved and moved on from within the last 150 years. But the thing about not knowing where to look for questions, that's human, and that goes back our entire history. And it's just going to be a problem forever, because it's how human minds work. So the problem of discovery in areas where you don't understand is just a fundamental problem of how to use minds to do science.
And do you think, so if you could go back in time, and without any of your knowledge, but if you could propose the questions that we are able to propose now, we would be in a much better off situation if we were thinking about better questions.
I'm not sure. I think there's somewhere in Tolstoy's War and Peace where he says, somebody is speaking on behalf of somebody. I don't know if it's one of the characters or if it's the narrator or who, but somebody, because this is all 30 years ago for me, but somebody says, why don't we just write the Cliff's Notes to War and Peace and tell, who did what, and then we'll have it done. And Tolstoy's point is that that's not where the reality of life is carried. The reality of life is carried in all the actual stories of how things really happen and how people really are. And so the summary of the plot is just a structuring device, but the substance of the story is in the experiencing of all of these complicated realities. I think it's the same in science. I think if you were to go back to Galileo's time and show him a jetliner, none of his flying machines would have worked. And if you had shown him this enormous lump that looks like a building and is actually a 747, and said, however many hundreds of years later, this thing will take off and go up into the air, Galileo could have sort of distantly glimpsed that such things would be conceivable, but there's no way he could have had the kind of operational understanding that a child can have today of all the different engineering components that make that real. So I think you have to go through the phenomenology, all the nuts and bolts of discovering the details of how things work. And it's only after you have that lived experience that you can look back and you can put a Cliff's Notes over it, which is what theory does, and say, this is an abstraction that allows you to navigate all of that complicated space without getting lost. But the abstraction is not a substitute for all of the sort of content detail that the abstraction puts into nice orderly packages.
Wow. Yeah, this is, again, it's very philosophically deep. So could you tell us about the thesis of your book about the biosphere being the fourth geosphere? What do you mean by that?
In some sense, it's the thing that we put up as the alternative to living things, where you say, I would never ask about a water molecule whether it is liquid or gas. In the same sense, I can't ask whether a water molecule on Earth is carrying the essence of the solid Earth or the oceans or the atmosphere or life, because one water molecule can go through all of those things. But if I wanted to understand the Earth, I would certainly want to understand that it has these major domains. It has the bulky rocky domain that does certain things, certain kinds of chemistry, and it anchors the planet's geometry. And then there's the little bit of water on the surface that's a different phase and that has different chemistry. And then there's the atmosphere, which does yet other things. It interacts with sunlight in different ways than the ocean or the rock does. And then there's the biosphere that occupies this whole other area of biochemical process, of organic chemical process, that the other three don't. And so you could say, okay, in terms of getting a crude look at the whole, which is the way Murray Gell-Mann likes to express these things, you would first recognize that there are these major phases and that the details are organized in communities within the major phases. And you could say, okay, how much of the information is being carried in the major phase? Just the fact that this is in the bulky rock, or that it's in the ocean, or in the atmosphere, or in the biosphere. And then you could say, okay, how much is left out? The major phases are only carrying part of the information. What do we need to understand next? What's carried in the ecosystem? What's carried in the individual? And then you work your way down within the individual. How much is carried in the fact that it's cellular and it has a genome? How much of it is carried in the life cycle? How much of it is carried in the ecological relations and what maintains them? And so the thesis of the book is just, I should argue that the book is not supposed to be mainly important for its thesis. The book is supposed to be mainly important as a tool to allow people to work in this area. Because if you think the way I do about doing origin of life work, you would believe that you can't do the best possible work or the most original work by working only in one domain. Because life didn't care about our academic domains. It is whatever it is, and it draws from all of these processes. So if we want a science of life that is faithful to the nature of life, we want to be attentive to where all of these other processes are part of the correct scientific description. But then if someone points you to a library and says, go learn, how are you ever going to start? You have hundreds and thousands of linear feet of papers. Most of it's wrong. A lot of it's junk. It'll take you forever. How do you start? So the point of the book was to try to reduce the cost of entry by saying, we can tell you a story, we can introduce you to the literature, and we can do it consistently across several different domains: geochemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, physiology, some bits about evolution, statistical physics, information theory, control theory. And we can show you that this is not incomprehensible, and it doesn't require longer than a lifetime to read. And we can give you a starting point in that reading. And that way, if you want to work in this area, you don't have to be old before you begin. You can start while you're still young and get something done. But then within it, the sub-thesis was just that one, that the nature of the living state is carried by the biosphere as a whole, that there are good arguments to think of it as a kind of a dynamic phase transition. And then we ask the question, what architectures make that phase transition possible? What is the importance of chemistry as a substrate? What is the importance of cellularization or other things as an important architectural motif? How can we break the question down in such a way that it's sensible and tractable?
How would you imagine if Earth had a different ecology? How do you imagine? So how different do you think life could have formed on a fundamental level?
I would love to know how to ask that question, and I don't.
All right.
So this is the issue of how big is chemistry. So we have all these, the thing that's amazing about chemistry on Earth is that it allows so many layers of complexity to be built, one on top of another on top of another. So the most fundamental question is, how many domains within chemistry even support that kind of elaboration of complexity? We have the Earth. It's the easiest place to do experiments. We can do chemistry at will. We can't reproduce what somehow has happened on the Earth. So we're missing fundamental things even there, even with the chemistry we can see, even with the chemistry we can do experiments on. We don't know what we haven't asked in the right way. Now, to answer the question that you posed, which is what we have to do if we're going to do planetary exploration, you say, go to some planet or some moon whose chemistry is off somewhere else here. is it capable of being interesting in the way biochemistry is interesting when we don't know how to answer that question, even for the most accessible chemistry we have? How do you do the counterfactual? That's where you have to have theory. You have to learn what's in the chemical space and learn how to systematically explore it, preferably guided by needing to get the correct answers for the chemistry we already have on Earth, which we still can't do. So that's how hard that question is.
And I have a question about theories. I think you'd be. I've had this for a while. I think you'd be the right person to ask. So in physics, I feel when we say theory, it's much more established hard fact than, for example, in other sciences. When we say theory, they're much more fragile. Yeah. So since you're good with words, how am I right? Do I have a point, or am I just?
You entirely have a point. Yes. This is a challenge, which is that the language of science always draws words from the common language, but then it gives them very particular meanings within the scientific domain that they did not have in the common language. And so in the common language, most words don't have what I would call operational definitions. If you take a word like cat or dog or cow, that's pretty concretely defined. You know what is or is not a cat, is or is not a dog. If you take a word like emergence or theory or belief, those do not have similarly concrete definitions. They often are sort of metaphors layered on top of metaphors. The most you get is what the linguist Vygotsky called family resemblances, where words tend to kind of cluster together because in a way they seem to kind of refer to the same thing. And so the word theory in the common language has this flavor of something ventured or tentative and uncertain and hypothetical. Within science, that usage has mainly been taken over by the word hypothesis. Many sciences do not actually have anything that fills the role that theory fills in physics. Physics, in some sense, occupies the domain of the simplest problems people could find, and therefore the problems that we have the strongest lock on. They tend to be the problems that are the best reducible, in the sense that there's little enough complexity in them that you can break the parts apart, you can understand the parts, you can then understand the rules of assembly, you can understand the new aspects of irreducible organization that come from the rules of assembly, but you can know how the composites are constrained by the parts. And so physics has largely consisted of the problems that submit well to being solved by that kind of method. So they're simple in a certain important fundamental sense, even if some things like gravitational waves are extraordinarily difficult technically, or the Higgs boson, to get measurements on. The principles behind them still live at a pencil and paper level. Unlike the stock market, which is really easy to get data on, but which has no principles at all, or very close to, so nothing like a theory. So in the domain of simple problems, you can say that there is just observation, which is just facts that we think we can get definite on. Then there's what's called phenomenology, which is things like Carnot's understanding of heat engines, or the original Faraday trying to understand electromagnetism and recognizing that there are connections between charges and electricity, or between currents and magnetism, things like that. Coulomb, Ohm, those all live in the domain that physics calls phenomenology, where you start to recognize that there are regular patterns, you can quantify them, but there's not a sense that you have kind of a unified theory of cause.
Is that what we call laws
Not yet.
Ohm's law? That kind
The word law used to be used for those, yes. You're exactly right. Coulomb's law, Ohm's law, Faraday's law, and so forth. And so Yeah, so law is yet another word that comes in and makes things complicated. In the phenomenologist's domain, laws are these kind of reliable regularities that you're sure you can trust and you can quantify, even if you're not sure you know cause behind them. Then you go one level beyond that, and that's where the word theory starts to come in physics. So you have things like Newton's theory of gravity, where you can take all of Kepler's and Copernicus's phenomenology, and you can say, I can write down an F equals ma and a form F equals gmm over r squared. And I can recover all that phenomenology by a process of construction from a simpler thing. We call it a law again. But Newton's law is not a law in the same sense as Kepler's laws were. Kepler's were phenomenological laws. Newton's are theoretical laws. Maxwell can take Faraday and I guess Coulomb, not Ohm, because Ohm is a material property. And he can put together a law that unifies electromagnetism, and now you have Maxwell's equations, which are a law for electromagnetism. And more than that, they are a theory of electromagnetism, where Maxwell says, I need to introduce this quantity called a field and stipulate that the field relates to charges in a certain way, and that the field has dynamics that obey a set of equations. So you're starting to introduce new objects into the discourse, which are not just the objects of phenomenology, and you're committing to mathematical relations, quantifiable relations among the objects. So that structure that you build up is what physics uses the word theory for. And then Einstein comes and says, I need to do the same thing for gravitation. I need to make geometry dynamic, and I need to introduce fields that characterize the geometry and that satisfy an equation of motion the same way Maxwell's fields did for electromagnetism. And Einstein was entirely basing his view of general relativity on what Maxwell had shown to be possible for electromagnetism. So in physics, the technical sense of theory is this sense of building a vocabulary where every term in the vocabulary refers to something you can completely operationalize in terms of how you do an experiment, what you measure, how you interpret the measurement, and then how you use it to check a calculation as being either true or false. It's that whole big structure. And in a proper physics theory, none of the terms do not have an operationalization in that sense. So whereas theory had this flavor of tentativeness in its old common language use, in physics, by the time you get to a theory, that is as reliable a piece of knowledge as anything that exists in the world. It may not be the most familiar. Quantum states and quantum measurement and decoherence are not familiar for us, but what the terms mean operationally, a state vector, an observable, a decoherence event, and how the mathematical relations that we're committing to as our understanding of nature, those have no violations ever. So there's nothing in human experience that is more reliable than these. The best anything can ever achieve is to never have been wrong, even once. So it's kind of the limit of the best we know how to do. So that makes conversation really challenging, right? Because you have this one word that means things that are vastly separate in human experience, depending on the context where it's being used. And there are many other sciences where there is nothing that yet has the status of a theory in that sense. And sometimes they only have the status of a theory or a law in the phenomenological sense. It is okay to say that evolution has the status of a theory in biology. But to me, it's, if you were to walk up to me on the street and say, I want to build a bridge, can you tell me how? And I said, yes, use mathematics. You would not be impressed. You would say, yeah, of course. If I had asked you about building a bridge or, calculating a mortgage amortization or epidemiology, the answer would always have been use mathematics. I want to build a bridge. Can you tell me something particular? So to say that the biosphere evolves under Darwinian evolution is a little bit like answering the question about the bridge by saying use mathematics. Yes, of course it applies to vastly many things, but precisely because it's so general, it's not doing the hard work of telling you how to answer most particular questions. So yes, it's a theory, but it's a theory whose generality limits how much you're telling anyone when you say it.
It's a high level. It's that the theories level is high as opposed to physics theories that are low level of atoms, or there is a gap. So there is so from evolution. So in physics, you got the quantum theories, but from quantum you can't get to evolution. Evolution doesn't tell you anything about the quantum or gravitational or the magnetic fields.
Yeah, I think I'd put it, I think I would make the following analogy. In mathematics, we have something called the law of large numbers, which says that for certain ways of taking samples with lots of entries and then aggregating them, the aggregate value will tend to have certain stability properties that the individual things do not. And the law of large numbers is incredibly important. You can apply it to gambling, but you can also apply it to thermodynamics, and you can apply it to quantum field theory. So the law of large numbers is not exactly a theory of any particular thing in physics, but it's this incredibly general role that combinatorics plays in the theories of a lot of different things. And without the law of large numbers, you would not have quantum field theory, because you have to have that to have renormalization. And without renormalization, you don't understand why any theory is stable of anything. So I feel like Darwin's natural selection is a kind of a minimally structured law. It's a bit more structured than the law of large numbers. It's a bit more particular because it assumes individuals and populations and generational structure. But it's also extremely general in that it's not committing to what the individuals are or how the populations work or what the generation structure is. So it's playing a role in biology a little bit like the mathematical role that the law of large numbers plays in many branches of physics and many other things too.
Wow. Now we know how theories work. So we have life now. How much can we make life in a lab?
No, not
We
yet.
can't.
Not by a long shot.
Any form of life.
It depends on what you mean make.
Right. Some viruses I've heard you could build in a lab. Simple viruses.
You can take a genome sequence and then you have enough molecular machinery that you can copy that genome sequence.
Right.
You can take all of the genes out of, you can sequence them in one organism. You can build the genes in a cell-free system with molecules. You can take that chromosome and you can put it in a cell, and then the cell will live. So Craig Venter's lab did this. Hamilton Smith was the leader of a project like that. In what sense have you made something? You have shown that the molecular components that you have are sufficient to do all the work. So you've shown that there's not something missing in the cell that you didn't discover that was doing part of the work. You haven't, of course, assembled a whole cell. You took a complete cell, and then you took a genome and put in it. Eventually, we'll be able to take membranes and proteins and components and genomes, and as we get technically more sophisticated, we'll be able to put all the components of a cell together and say, there, it's a cell. But in what sense have you made anything? You haven't had to understand anything causally to do that. You've had to isolate a bunch of components and become able to build them and then be able to assemble them. But you haven't answered any why questions. You have answered only how questions and what questions. So if I think about what it means to have understood the origin of life and shown that you understand it by making things, I think you have to answer what, how, and why questions, all three. And the fact that, so how to say, when people criticize education, and this is like a teeny, teeny, tiny version of the thing that science makes a huge version of. When people criticize education, they say, don't just do rote memorization. Ask your students to think, ask them to solve problems. Because they say, even if you skip some of the memorization, if your students learn to think, they can go back and fill that in, and it's a good use of time. Whereas you can have students who are great at memorizing things, but then if you ask them to solve a new problem, they have no skills at all. They're still children. And in general, within education, we think some version of that argument is roughly right. You need to memorize a certain amount, but you shouldn't only memorize. You also need thinking skills. Well, apply that to our biochemistry problem. If all you're doing is making an exact copy of an exact genome of an exact cell and putting it in another cell, it seems to me like you're doing an extreme version of the memorization. You're not thinking. Whereas I think what we all would love, and I don't mean this as a criticism of any of this work. As molecular engineering, it's a tour de force, and the people doing it are giants. But any person with a reasonable level of humility will also say that if we talk about understanding the origin of life and making life, we want the thing that's analogous to that thinking, problem-solving part, not just memorizing and copying. And that we're not anywhere close to doing. And it's incredible how much people know. It's so much more than nothing. But if we did an honest account of how many other things are also true of life, where we have no good ideas at all, I bet you would find that by a factor of 50 to 1 or 100 to 1, the things we don't have any good ideas about at all outnumber the things where we do have plausible ideas. So there's just a huge amount of work and imagination that still needs to be provided to get there.
And do you think advancements in understanding the DNA could potentially help us with the origin of life or not?
For bits and pieces. An area where I'm a huge fan right now is work on the history of the ribosome and very early proteins. So that's an area where we have history that goes back from before the origin of translation. And that history is locked in and we can reconstruct it. We have no understanding what the evolutionary dynamics look like in that early era, because all the evolutionary dynamics we understand depends entirely on translation to even exist. So what process was it that was laying down layers of structure in an era before translation exists? Because the structure it was laying down is the machinery that does translation. So that's an area where I think we have a data gold mine and we have no compelling ideas at all. And that's a great area to work. Because where you have no data, then you're looking for the data and you're looking for ideas. So you're lost in both directions. But if you have an area where you have really rich data and no ideas, then at least you know what the answer to the test question is. You just don't know what the test question was. And there are lots of areas like that that can be done. Mineralogy, carbon in the deep earth. And so people are doing good work in all these areas. I still think computational chemistry is an incredibly fertile area because it's now strong enough to begin to do something, but its really powerful generation is still in front of us.
What is one discovery you're most looking forward to, Oscar?
Understanding why the genetic code has the form it does and how that connects to the earliest proteins and the earliest RNAs. I think that's a solvable problem, and I might live long enough to see a good solution to it come into existence. Also, enough of the geochemistry may be solved that we start to attach numbers to whether or not the citric acid cycle could ever have been self-amplifying in geochemistry, whether it's unique or not. That problem was stalled for a long time, but there are now several labs doing really terrific work on that. not clear whether they see enough questions and are doing enough to really provide an answer, but at least it's moving again, and the stuff they're discovering is deeply satisfying and very beautiful. So it's much better than nothing. That was where all my time was going for 20 years, and I've gone into these other areas because I had no real good ideas to contribute in other areas. So I have to rely on them and stay connected to their work and hope that maybe it triggers an idea somewhere down the line.
Final question. Have you ever had a eureka moment?
In little teeny tiny areas, yeah.
Right. Would you like to share with us any?
Oh, it's completely trivial stuff.
Right, right.
Realizing that I know how to calculate the solution to the determinant of a certain matrix.
Okay.
Yeah, silly little stuff, the kind of stuff that students would normally be doing. But here's a thing that is fun. If you have time and nothing to do, which of course we all have tons of, there's a wonderful book by Alexander Luria from the 1960s called The Mind of a Mnemonist. And it has to do with synesthesia, autism, and its role in memory. And I don't know how many people are like me in this. I am not a synesthetic person in that letters and colors and sounds for me are still separate modalities most of the time. But when your mind is in its really relaxed form, the form where ideas come in, it often tends to be much more synesthetic or synesthesic, whatever the correct usage is. And so when I get one of these ideas, if I happen to be out on a morning run, and the moment when it occurs to me I know how to solve the determinant is also a moment when I happen to be jumping over a small ditch and being careful not to twist my ankle. That whole moment will remain available, attached to that determinant forever. So the whole mind is there at the same time, and the smell of the grass and the shape of the ditch and the feeling of the motion and the solution of the determinant are part of one state of mind. And Szilard talks about this when he talks about seeing the chain reaction and stepping off a bus. So I know other people have this experience, and I suspect it's probably pretty common. But I find that interesting in terms of using the mind and how best to relax the mind and make it able to do its best work in seeing new things. I like the thought of being methodological and looking for that relaxed state in a better way, sort of knowing how it works and what it feels like. And we have access to that, both from our own experiences and from things other people write.
Do you meditate by any chance?
Probably not.
Right.
But that has become such a trendy thing that I don't want to claim any knowledge or participation in it, because I know people who are serious about it and know a lot and have committed themselves over the course of a lifetime. And I don't want to be disrespectful to those people's knowledge by imagining that I know anything about it when I haven't put in the work.
I see. But
it's a natural question to ask, and I wonder the same kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on free will, since
it's a term that needs to mean something first.
Well, free will. Yeah, that's a good question. Defining what we mean by free will. Yeah. Yeah, that I think most people's perception of free will is wrong, because you're just following laws of nature, but you have degrees of freedom within that. So
yeah, but what's the question, right?
Yeah. Again, yeah, you're looking for exact defined terminology. I don't have it. So.
Well, I think what I'm looking for is good categories. So if you live in the ancient world where you like to ask the question, are viruses alive or not? The fact that you can endlessly go in circles chasing your tail on that is a signal that you probably are not using good categories. But that doesn't mean that you know what categories to replace them with that are better. And of course, in spite of the fact that I have made this heroic claim that it's a category error to ask whether things are alive and you should look for life as a phase transition, you know how many people actually are using that terminology? At most one, which is me. Maybe occasionally someone else in a slip. But most people are perfectly happy to continue asking whether viruses are alive, and they don't care that I think that it should be asked in a different way. So I think that the tangles they get themselves in show the category error. I think there are better categories available, and the fact that I think that has had no consequence in the world at all. Similarly, for free will, I think the fact that it's such a tangled mess is an indication that the language it's not capable of carrying much weight. It's an impressionistic poetic language that doesn't have categories at all. And so we are looking for better categories. Where will they come from? I have opinions on that, but I don't think there's any nice, clean approach to it that carries as much weight as I think the phase transition language will carry for the nature of the living state. It's a harder problem.
And on that note, we'll end the interview. Thank you very much.
What a pleasure. What fun talking to you.
Great.